Hey guys, welcome to the third layer of the 3 layers of awesome for training. This is the peak. So obviously what we're going to go into now is a bit more detail into what that final sort of portion of training is. We covered in the first layers obviously mobility, strength training, sort of the very basics that you need to build into, some conditioning. The next phase we actually then started working into a bit more dynamic mobility work and obviously started to look at the training in a bit more detail in terms of what you need to be working on. So the three obviously structures of the phosphagen, the lactic acid, the anaerobic and the aerobic systems, and then starting to look at the periodization of what you need to be concentrating on for your particular goals. So if your goal is to get bigger, if your goal is to get leaner, if your goal is to get stronger, whatever it may be, you have to then emphasize certain areas of your training to get that effect. So the peak obviously is then taking that a little step further, looking into periodization models and actually assessing what we want to train and how we train at UPeak Performance. So this first video of a two-part, again, series on the peak is going to discuss the different periodization models, some pros and cons, and what we looked at from UPeak Performance as sort of good and bad points of each one, and taking into our own training. And then I'll explain the UPeak Performance style of periodization and how that will work for different individuals, whether your goal is sport specific, whether it's general, or whether it's a kind of a mixture of the both and you're looking to just give yourself some purpose to train. Okay, so hopefully if you're not too bored by this, obviously you can get to the end. Hopefully you'll take some information out of it. If not, then obviously, as I say guys, this is the peak stuff. So this is the stuff that a lot of people sometimes don't care about, so don't feel you have to watch this video if you don't want to listen to me bang on about periodization and models and all the rest of it. So what we're looking at today, the three main sort of periodization models there's probably a million of them, and again, I'm only going by my experience and what I've used and what I actually put into my training, so I'm not going to discuss other things that I've never tried before. Okay, so the three main ones we're going to discuss today: linear, the conjugate method, and block periodization. Okay, I'm just going to explain in this video the difference between the three, what as I say, some pros and cons, and then obviously how we work that into our own periodization here at UPeak Performance. So first and foremost, the linear progression. The linear progression is obviously probably the most sort of the oldest and the most popular form of periodization to use within athletics or within the sort of athletic field. Okay, the goal is basically that you have a competition and then you'll start off, your block will be over here, and whether that is 1 year or 2 years or 4 years as in the Olympics, you start off at a certain level and then you build yourself up towards that goal of the Olympics, okay, or let's just use the Olympics as our example. Obviously there may be other competitions in between that you would pick for to kind of test yourself, to kind of build up towards those qualifiers that would then build to the Olympics from there, but that's generally how it would work. You would start from point A, and point B, the last point should be the Olympics, okay, so you would work from there. And the linear progression obviously works from that. My understanding of it in weight training and in general populist training though is that you're basically starting off with higher volume sort of work, and then working down in volume, and then working higher in intensity. So as you can see here, this is the standard chart you'll normally use. Volume down the left, intensity down the bottom. As we go along from week to month to year, the volume goes down and the intensity slowly will build up. Okay, so at the start, for example, you might be doing 3 sets of 10, and then by the end of the cycle, you might be doing 10 sets of 3, for an example. Okay, that would be a perfect linear sort of progression through the weeks and months, working through over the periodization, shall I say. The linear progression would obviously be adding weight to the bar each week at the same sort of reps. Okay, so I don't want to mix those two up, but the periodization, it works in that sense. Okay, you're starting off very high volume, very low intensity, and building up towards the goal of being your peak for the end, working at a lower volume. Okay, so that's how the linear progression works. The conjugate, this is the one that I've played around with quite a lot with more recently over the last couple of years, but the conjugate method is basically most popularised by Louis Simmons and the West Side Barbell. There's 1,000,001 different variations of it, and obviously there's arguments for and against it. But basically the idea is you have 3 main areas that you're training on. You train everything of equal measure through the year, so there's no ups and downs in volume, no ups and downs in intensity. Everything is smashed out as much as it can be, but as I'll explain a little later, that's not necessarily true, but that's the general idea of conjugate training. Everything is trained the same throughout the year. Okay, and then you've got block periodization. Okay, the very last one. The idea of block periodization is everything is done in blocks. It's almost very similar to the linear progression, but it's sort of structured a bit differently. So you're actually emphasizing elements, but those elements are much more sort of set, and you're working through in blocks of 4 to 12 weeks, for example. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a sec. So they're the 3 areas that we're going to be discussing today. So linear progression to start off with. As I say, very popular. Been used through the years. It works. There's no question it works. You know, there's people that again argue against all 3, and there's the pros and cons, as we say, that we will try and discuss it today. But it does work, and it's worked over the years. Is it the best? I don't know. I'm not qualified enough probably to stand there and give my opinion on that, but it certainly works. The flaws of it obviously are going to be pretty similar to the flaws of the block periodisation, in that when you are not training a quality, you will lose that quality. So, you know, practice makes perfect, as they say. So at the start of the volume, when your volume's high and your intensity is low, obviously at that stage, you're not training with enough intensity to warrant that response. So you're not training your strength side of things, okay? So, you know, the phosphagen system, obviously, for example, won't be getting trained very, very hard at that stage, but your anaerobic and, you know, your aerobic even, you know, if you're training in that style, will be trained quite highly at that point. As you go along the training cycle, obviously the volume starts coming down and the intensity starts rising. So then you're starting to go further into the phosphagen system and further away from the aerobic system and going into the anaerobic to phosphagen. So you see, if we're using it in the 3 energy pathways that we utilize, okay, and we train in UP Performance and in training in general, you know, you're always going to lack somewhere along the line that particular goal. Now that's could be a good or a bad thing, but generally speaking, if you look at it in an extreme point of view, at one end, you're never training your strength, so your strength's always going to suffer. And by the time you get to your strength, your hypertrophy, your endurance, everything else is going to suffer badly at that stage. So you know, when you come back to your endurance stage, for example, you'll be lacking endurance, you'll be lacking, you know, the muscle. So it's going to be really tough again to try and start all over again to try and build that back up. And then by the time you get over to the strength, you'll be pretty weak because you've been training, you know, for higher reps and more endurance-based stuff, and it's going to get quite hard. So you can see there, the crossing over one to the other gets quite difficult, and a yo-yo effect, and it's why a lot of people say it doesn't really work. You're not, you know, you're never training to the quality. Now, in terms of peaking for performance for example, Olympics or something like that, it kind of makes sense. You kind of start off with the base, you're kind of building things up, and then you're building towards a competition, and by the time you get to that competition, your training is more and more specific to that competition, and therefore you'll be at peak condition for that competition. But in the meantime, you've worked on all your weaknesses towards that goal of the competition. So you can see linear progression does work. It's just how you implement it into your training and why you're implementing it into your training, okay? But that is the main con there. When you're working on one, the other suffers, okay? The conjugate method, it works off of 3 basic principles. You've got the max effort method, you've got the dynamic method, and you've got the repetition method, okay? This is much more of what Lewis Simmons brought into this conjugate system from there. The idea is everything's trained at a pretty similar level, okay? So your max effort, you're maxing out every single week on certain lifts, okay, whether it be a squat and a press, or whether it be, you know, various different forms. You know, I've brought in sort of pulls, so you can, you know, bring in Olympic lifts as well. So the idea is that you change that movement every 1 to 3 weeks, because you can't train over 90% on a particular movement for more than 3 weeks without showing negative effects on that, okay? So what they do is they continuously change and bring in special exercises that will strengthen the main movements, okay? So for example, at the you know, Westside Barbell, as I say, they have a squat day and they have a bench day that are both maximum effort days, and those days they will train different variations of bench, so close grip bench, incline bench, floor presses, maybe seated presses as well, all to strengthen the muscle there and actually strengthen that bench press. And then for the squat, they'll find different things that will strengthen the squats, so different box squats, overhead squats, you know, belt squats, anything that's going to also get that squat movement, strengthen particular muscles that might be weak, and find weaknesses within those movements. So that's what you're training in the maximum effort method, okay? The dynamic effort method is normally trained between 40 up to about 75% of the maximum of the lift, using chains and bands and things like that. That's about using power production and obviously getting more force under the bar, okay? So that's why they use the chains, that's why they use the bands, okay? And the repetition method obviously is the muscle building, the assistance work, the high rep stuff, okay? So you'll see from there, they have high intensity, they have power, and they have repetition. So there, automatically, they're training 3 great qualities from there. There's the phosphagen system being worked, okay? They've got the anaerobic system being worked, and if they throw in some conditioning-based stuff and some high rep work, then you're going to get the aerobic system being kicked in as well. So they actually work on all 3. It's a pretty good all-round encompassing sort of training style, and for most people that sort of style of training actually works quite well, though it's been geared towards powerlifters and geared powerlifters into that sense. It's actually a really good system to get the results that you want if your goal is just to be a complete sort of athlete, to be able to do all things. Okay, so it's the way you implement it though that will change that system. So the positives are all there. The negatives, I suppose, if you want to say it, is that you're never really specialising in any particular area. So therefore, you may find that you'll never actually, if your endurance is something that you lack in, you've only got so much space in your training week. So you can't really give the time and effort to that endurance training whilst you're also training maximally, whilst you're also training power, whilst you're also training, the anaerobic sort of pathways for muscle building. That endurance may have to be just squashed down, and you won't be able to emphasize it in any way through the week without adding in extra time to train. So your training times then become quite big, or so frequent that you're training almost every day, and it becomes a lot for the body. Okay. Other elements like strength and power and muscle size, those things can be altered and changed, but things like endurance will lack. So that is probably the one thing I'll say. Now, some people will say, okay, that's fine. I'll train, you can train conjugate style 3 or 4 times a week, and then 1 or 2 times a week go for a mile run. That's perfectly fine, and that will actually lead to some pretty decent gains in endurance as well. But as I say, it's all about a time management thing. So obviously with the efficiency strength system, and what I found myself being a busy parent and worker, it gets quite difficult to kind of just go, oh well, I'll just train 3 or 4 times a week, and I'll do an hour's run, and I'll do this, and I'll do that, and it just starts adding up more and more stuff all the time. So you end up just overtraining, or just not seeing anyone else in your life because you're spending so much time training in there. So that would be my probably biggest con from that side of things. It can be manipulated, it can be changed, and that's something that we could go into a little later on down the line. But as I say, as a main point for the periodisation, that is probably the biggest drawback from the conjugate method, is that you'd have to keep adding things in or changing things too much to get the effects that you want. Block periodisation is the last one. So as I say, this is fairly similar to the linear progression, but the thing with block progression is there's no set thing. Okay, the goal generally over 3 to 6 weeks to 12 weeks maybe, you have particular goals. So for example, I've given you an example here: 6 weeks of hypertrophy work, you then move on to 6 weeks of strength work, you then move on to 6 weeks of endurance. Okay, so as you can see, in terms of what you do, the same drawback there might be the same drawback as the linear. When you're working on endurance, your hypertrophy is not necessarily getting the work it needs to, and your strength certainly is not getting the work it needs to. And if you keep going in these patterns, for example, by the time you get back to your strength, you're obviously going to be lacking quite a bit of strength as you get back to it. When you get back to your hypertrophy, you wouldn't have concentrated on your hypertrophy for more than 12 weeks. So you might lose muscle, or you might find that your muscle conditioning is dropping because you're spending so much time in the other pathways. So that gives you a general idea of it. The same drawback applies if you go totally into it and say, right, this is a complete hypertrophy zone, we're just going to train like a bodybuilder. This zone we're going to train like a power lifter and just lift heavy weights, and this one we're going to train like an endurance athlete and do lots of running and cycling and biking and high rep work on the weights. If you literally took it as it says, the drawback here is the exact same drawback that you have for your linear progression. Okay, is that you will find that by the time you come back to something, you could be either be as bad as you were when you last did it, when you last started, or you could be a little bit worse because you're so beaten up from the other stuff, and you come back to the other one. The good thing about it obviously is it's a mental break, so obviously each block you do would be nice because it's a fresh start, it's a fresh training cycle, and you would be training in a different way. So it's good for people that like to train multiple skills or like to train multiple things through the year and don't like doing the same thing. Okay, so that's a brief description of each one. So in the next video, what we're going to discuss is actually how we take the positive elements and how I utilise them in the UP performance periodisation model, and how we then take them into, because obviously, as I said, the goal is we still want to emphasise certain areas, we still want to follow these sort of progressions, these sort of periodisations, but we want to structure through the year that we can work to and what we can periodise to. Okay, guys, so hope you enjoyed that. Hope it wasn't too much gabble. As I say, it's just my opportunity to then talk about that next level now, that peak performance, the stuff that you need to do to be at that top level and to be awesome. You need to concentrate on these sort of things. So, but hopefully you enjoyed that, guys. Just be awesome. Have a great week. I'll see you next Monday for Movement Monday, and next Friday we'll go through part 2.